The RockShox Pike is one of the best known suspension forks on the market, and for good reason. The previous Pike, or its first and second generation, was some of the most versatile forks out there on the market. You could ride them on your trail bike, your enduro bike, even on your dirt jump bike. So pretty much they appeared everywhere. Then along came the new Lyric. It's a longer travel, burlier fork, and it had some really good performance attributes. And so perhaps the Pike got a little bit lost in its way. What was it really there for? RockShox realised this, and so they've redesigned the Pike for 2018. It's not just a few tweaks here and there, but it's a totally redesigned fork, with a lot of inspiration coming from the Lyric. What they wanted to do was basically get the Lyric, but make it lighter, a little bit smaller, and more applicable for trail riders. So in essence, this really is a trail fork now, not a do-it-all fork. So there are three main changes to the Pike for 2018. There's a new chassis, there's a new airspring, the Debonair airspring, and they've brought in the new Charger 2 damper that we saw on the SID last year. The 29er Pike will come in 120 to 140mm versions, while the 650B one will come in 120 to 160mm options. There's also two damper options. There's the RCT3, which is a top spec one, and a simpler RC. Each of those then also gets a remote version, so there's actually 4 different damper options for each of the forks. Traditionally, people have taken the 29er fork in order to fit the bigger 2.8 to 3 inch plus tyres on a 27.5 inch wheel. However, for the new chassis, 2.8 inch tyres will fit into the 27.5 inch Pike. If you do want to go up to 3 inches, then you might need to get a 29er one, maybe tyre dependent. This year the Pike only comes in a boost width standard, so that's 110mm between the dropouts. The reason RockShox say they've done this is to make the engineering design a little bit easier. So instead of having one design and then stretching it to fit those wider hubs, they've been able to build just one chassis, which means they can engineer it better, so they say. That means if you've already got a set of wheels which aren't boost width, then you're either going to need adapters or a new front wheel. The result of going for this new chassis though is that they've been able to shave a reported 150 grams off the lower leg, so that's a fair weight saving, and they say this has been done without losing any stiffness. Finally, you get a 180mm post-mount disc brake, so the smallest rotor you can use with the new Pike is 180mm. And you get the torque cap wheel fitment system, so that's a slightly bigger diameter wheel interface. Obviously you can use normal wheels without that, but if you do go for say a SRAM wheel with the torque caps, you do get a slightly stiffer interface there. Also new is the Debonair airspring. What this means is that there's a slightly larger negative airspring. In theory, this then gives better small bump sensitivity and a little bit more mid-stroke support. Adjusting the tokens in the fork is as easy as it ever was. However, now the top of the fork is a little bit lower profile, as to get into the airspring you use a cassette tool rather than a socket set. What this means is that it's a lower stack, so in a crash you're less likely to damage the down tube of your bike with the top of the airspring. And that's reflected on the other side with the Charger 2 damper. We first saw the Charger 2 damper on the SID, which came out last year. It has 3 modes. There's the open, a pedal and a firm mode. Previous generation's firm mode was more of a lockout, but this one still has a little bit of movement in there. Previously, the lock sort of function was dictated by spring, and now it's done by hydraulic pressure, which means it's a lot easier for a remote lever to work. In the RCT3 version, you get the low speed compression adjustment in the open mode, and there's a wider range of adjustment in that for this year with the same number of clicks. The trail mode is also a little bit friendlier for sort of rolling terrain, so it's less of a sort of a pedal platform and more of one which you can use on mellower trails where you need to pump a little bit more to maintain speed. I've been lucky enough to ride the 150mm 27.5 inch RCT3 model of the fork, which comes in at £940. I fit the fork to my Transition Scout, which is my long-term bike for BikeRadar, and predominantly most of my testing has been done out in the Alps. So lots of steep terrain, lots of rocky, rooty bits and pieces, quite technical in places, but also super fast, super flowy, basically loads of fun. And I guess really this is where the Pike should do really well. It wasn't big man-made like bike park stuff, but it was natural trails in the mountains. So I kind of really feel that this is where the Pike should excel. Generally speaking, it actually really did. So the first thing I noticed was the initial stroke of the fork is super supple. Whether it's going over roots or sort of real rocky terrain, there's a really nice insulation between what's going on under the wheel and the bars, but not to the extent that you don't know what's going on. What I mean by that is there's relatively little buzz, the fork seems super plush and super active, which makes it more comfortable, It's obviously got the rapid recovery rebound on there as well, so the fork stays pretty well glued to the floor until you actually want it to come off the floor. You're not getting pinged around the place. And then on the bigger stuff, it definitely ramps up where it needs to. In a week's riding of probably 10 to 15,000 metres of descending on relatively gnarly terrain, I did bottom out the fork a couple of times, but obviously the fork is really composed as it goes all the way through its travel. Top of the stroke is great, as is the mid-stroke. Cliched as it sounds, there is a lot more support there than you might imagine. I haven't had to prop up the fork with tokens or extra air pressure like you might have had to have done with the older Pike. On steeper terrain or on prolonged sort of impacted stuff, say root beds or longer rock garden sections, the fork wasn't finding its way to the depths of its travel. It never felt on the really steep stuff that the fork was diving away beneath you. So having that support meant that the fork and the bike remained propped up. It stayed higher up in its travel, which is what you want from that mid-stroke support. I was running 2.5-inch tyres on a 30mm internal rim, had no clearance issues whatsoever. In those tight switchbacks where literally your bar is 90 degrees to the frame and you're sat on that front wheel almost, there was no noticeable flex or twisting going on. So I'd suggest that RockShox have done a pretty good job with the chassis. It's not as big as say the Lyric is, the fore to aft flex is there compared to a Lyric, but it's not built to be as rock solid as say the Lyric is, so I can't really complain about that. One thing I'm not a big fan of from a usability point of view is the restriction of only having the boost width wheels. It did make my wheel choices a little bit more difficult on my long-term bike, and I think as a consumer that really is something that's going to put a lot of people off, especially if you're just upgrading a current bike. Another thing which perhaps I'm not such a big fan of, and it is only a little thing, but the top cap for the airspring so you can adjust the pressure. It is lower profile and it's kind of a crescent shape on the top. Just where you need the most leverage, i.e. at the ends of that crescent, is where it's at its smallest. So if it's been done on slightly too tight, or if I don't know, the temperature's changed or whatever, it's really difficult to get that little cap undone. From a usability point of view, I don't think it's ideal, and I did prefer the older one. So as you can tell, I'm kind of nitpicking here, and that's because it's a really great fork. The airspring, it does all those cliche things you want it to do. It's soft off the top, it's got plenty of mid-stroke support, and it ramps up great towards the bottom of its stroke. The chassis is stiff, it's stable, it's easy to use, and it'll fit pretty much any trail bike out there, any wheel size, so they've kind of got it all. If it was me building a trail bike right now, I'd be tempted by fitting the Pike over the Fox 34. I like a stiffer chassis. I found the 34 does twang around a little bit, and the damping, the Fit4 damper is great on the Fox, but then the Pike's damping's really good as well. So for me, I'd go the Pike.